Welcome to Future Forward, a limited series of conversations with diverse documentary filmmakers about our future during the crises of 2020. I'm your host, Anjanette Levert. I am a filmmaker, professor, curator, programmer, and coach in the documentary sphere. Future Forward has been made possible by Spelman College's Carnegie Rockefeller Divisional Priority Faculty Award, where I'm a lecturer and currently helping to head up the documentary film program there. This series was inspired by the author Arundhati Roy. She wrote an article early in the global coronavirus crisis called "The Pandemic is a Portal." You know, the sentiment of that article really stuck with me, and the essence of it is, during these crises, there is an opportunity to break from the past and reimagine our world. So that's what I want to do with this series. So I've been meditating both personally and professionally over these last couple of months about what it is that I want to reimagine for my world. And then I thought, let me extend it to the documentary sphere. And because I've had conversations like these before, I wanted to record some of the thoughts of the best and brightest minds in the documentary industry about reimagining our world. So in this episode, we have Jennifer Crystal Chien. She is a documentary filmmaker, of course, who makes photography and animation as a part of her work, or she integrates photography and animation as a part of her work. She creates nonfiction media that interrogates the conventions of mainstream American storytelling. Her work centers on immigrants and people of color as focal points in complex and layered cultural landscapes. Her work has been recognized for artistic innovation by the Center for Cultural Innovation. She was a resident filmmaker with the Center for Asian American Media at the 9th Street Independent Film Center. She is the co-founder of Represent Media and serves as the co-organizer for the East Bay Documentary Support Group. So thank you so much. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you so much for being here. And there's plenty to talk about just from your artistic statement alone. So the first thing that I want to kind of take a look at is these ideas, and they're not new ideas. We're looking at it from a new space of like, how can we reimagine it? But new representations and more authentic portrayals of our communities. I think that would be a great place to start.
Thanks for having me today, Anjanette. I'd love to talk about that. I think that there's been a lot of energy and interest lately in this idea of BIPOC filmmakers being the lead of or heading up films that basically are telling stories from our own communities. So the idea that we need to tell our own stories because we have a particular insight or perspective on them, and being able to therefore make the representations of people in those films more nuanced and more holistic is really great. I think there's a lot of good filmmaking happening where people are doing that and telling stories that, perhaps in the past were told by, basically people who may not be familiar with the community, a lot of times white people, honestly, and people feeling a lot of frustration about that. So I think it's a time when a lot of people are thinking about who are telling the stories in documentary about different BIPOC communities. Mm-hmm. I think there's kind of also a bigger issue at play. Mm-hmm. And I think that bigger issue is that not only do we need to be leading those stories about our communities, but there's also an issue of the kinds of stories that we can tell about our communities. Mm. And so a lot of times in the documentary industry, with each sort of, I guess you could say, with each identity group, whether it's like ethnic, whether it's like, queer community, there is a sense that, there's only certain kinds of stories that you can tell and get mainstream support for, and that, that larger audiences, I guess I would say larger audiences, not even necessarily, like outside of our communities are really interested in hearing. And so those would be, each ethnic group has that, right? You can kind of probably name 5 or 10 different, themes or types of stories, with like, let's say, African-American filmmakers, with Asian American filmmakers, with Native American filmmakers, with Latinx filmmakers, right? So, yes. With Black filmmakers that would be, you know, films that involve some form of like, you know, drugs, violence, poverty, educational deficit, you know, like, you know, some kind of like, you know, crime, you know, those kinds of things are often the sorts of things that films are being made about, you
Right.
know, about Black communities.
Sure.
And
To the extent that it's also they're now sub-genres,
mhm.
so to speak. There's so many films in each of those that they're now like their own sub-genre.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And so, so what ends up happening is that, you know, we end up being in charge of those stories within these sort of areas. And, you know, don't get me wrong, I think that there's some really important and wonderful films that are being made about various social issues, and within these areas. But if that's the only kind of film that we can make in the documentary sector, and is so heavily on the problems that we have, then I think we still have an issue with representation.
Yeah.
And I feel like that we still need to broaden our idea of what documentary film is, the kinds of stories we can tell, and that they're not always focused around the problems that we have in communities. And I like to say that even though we have problems, we are not problems ourselves.
Yes.
And so, you know, this heavy focus on sort of social issue filmmaking in the documentary industry, you know, kind of keeps us to talking about our lives in relationship to these problems. And the reality is that we have lives outside of that, you know, that we have other things that we do with ourselves, you know, even though we have problems, they probably aren't occupying us 24 hours a day. Or, you know, with some people, you know, I don't want to diminish like the, you know, like the terrible situations that some people are in, if they're being detained by ICE, if they're being deported, you know, those kinds of like very nerve-wracking situations where it is occupying, you know, a person's time 24 hours a day. But I would say that there's a lot of people, you know, in our communities, you know, who are doing a whole number of things with their lives. And I think it's really important to see that entire portrayal of the rest of our lives and what else are we doing and how do we see ourselves and, you know, what are we doing when we're not facing a problem, so that people can, you know, we can really see ourselves as complete human beings in documentary media.
Right, which is interesting because people often ask me, oh, well, what kind of films do you make? And I'm like, I make films about things that interest me. And that usually is a little bit difficult for people to get with, you know, and they kind of like blankly stare at me. And then I'm like, well, okay, so I could say that I make films about social issue, you know, and then that tends to be much more palatable and something that people can grasp. And, but what I say is that I make films about people who are dealing with life, which, you know, because they're BIPOC, is going to probably include some of those social issues, just because that's how we navigate in the world, which is something that you frequently talk about, which is, you know, traversing these various identities that we possess here in this country, right? And so I definitely want to get into that. But yeah, that's always something that like I see like the blank stare when I'm like, I make films about things that interest me, you know, because, you know, the dominant culture, you know, white filmmakers, they just get to make films about whatever it is that they want, whether they're a part of the community or not. But then like, it's a whole big thing if I say that I want to, you know, make something about, you know, a community that I'm not directly a part of, right? It's just like, whoa, what, you can do that? And I'm like, yeah, you can, you know. However, and what is interesting is that that's not a question for reporters, that's not a question for journalists, right? Because it's seen that you should be, as a journalist or reporter, you should be able to go into any community and then quote unquote get the story. But you have these same things happening in journalism as well, as where people are not attuned to the nuances and the differences, you know, when in their reporting. And that frequently is exacerbated in documentary because we have something that's like, you know, longer than 90 seconds. So it's also, it's interesting in terms of, you know, what that representation looks like. And I would venture to say that most of us have come into this space wanting to change those narratives about who, you know, who all of us are, right?
I spent a little bit of time around journalists the last couple of years, and you know, some who were kind of associated with the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism and the program there, and some of the work that they're doing. And it's sort of, it is a question. So people are starting to inquire, and have in the last few years, about, people are starting to think also in journalism that the idea that a journalist doesn't bring some type of perspective or voice to their work is unrealistic.
Ludicrous, right?
Is unrealistic.
Right.
And so it's more, how do you acknowledge that, and how do you keep an eye out for how that might be influencing your story, rather than saying that, who I am doesn't add anything or bring anything or doesn't subtract anything either way to the story. And so I do see a similar trend happening in journalism. But I hear what you're saying. The classic version of, sort of traditional filmmaking, traditional journalism, is that the person coming to the story, they're just an observer, right? And it doesn't matter, who they are, except they mean that the observer, it doesn't matter if they're white, right? But if it's somebody else, then, somehow they aren't able to tell certain stories, they don't have the capacity to understand certain kinds of stories.
Or they impact the story, inadvertently by them being there. It's like,
they can't be objective because they're part of that community. So how could they tell an objective story about that community that they're a part of?
Right. But interestingly enough, the reason why a lot of, certainly for African Americans or Blacks, is that we were invited into the news because people didn't, the dominant culture of white people didn't want to go into Watts in these places that were burning during the riots of 67 and 68, right? So it's like, okay, so we invited you in because, you can go into those communities and quote unquote get the story. And then there's this conflict about like what story is going to be told, once you get back to the station, right? So it's like, this is like a never ending thing. Here we are almost 50, over 50 years later, still having these same conversations.
Well, there's an interesting thing that happens too, I think, with other forms of storytelling in documentary. So I was, so a few years ago, I co-founded a grassroots organization called Represent Media, and our purpose is to advocate for personal storytelling in documentary film and nonfiction media. And by personal storytelling, I don't mean autobiographical, although that can be. It just means focusing on the stories of individuals, families, community members, neighbors, other people, in a way that's not focused around a social issue or problem. And so one of the things that, and we also did a couple focus groups a couple years ago in an online survey of filmmakers working on these kinds of films. And we asked a question, how many filmmakers had experienced this phenomenon where, maybe similar to what you were talking about, that they have a film that they're working on, they have a certain kind of story they want to tell. If it's not, it's focused on an idea that they have about, what is this personal story about the individual family or community that they want to put out there. And they go out into the field and they find that people, other partners, people in the industry are kind of pushing back and saying, how can this film be more like a social issue film? How can they sort of shape it? How can they change that narrative? How can they change their vision so that it could be more, in a certain way, like a social issue film that other people can understand? And so there's this kind of this shaping of their narrative.
Right, but who are the other people? That's like a coded language for who are other people.
Well, I mean, honestly, I feel like there's that kind of falls into a couple camps, right? So other people are often, producers, funders, sometimes distributors who are now getting involved in documentary filmmaking much earlier on. And some people said, well, a lot of times it happens in relationship to white people. It also happens in relationship to the dominant culture, which is basically a culture of white supremacy. And so what's happening is that there's also, one person had a very interesting quote, from this work that we did, and who basically said that they didn't think it had to do with the race of the person giving the feedback, that they had gotten feedback from also BIPOC people in the community who also try to shape their representation in the film and their narrative in a way, and try to react to their work in a way that didn't seem authentic either, right? So one person actually went out of their way to say, I don't think it's about race. I think it's about this this approach or this mentality that people have. But that approach does come from the idea that there's a certain way that we should be seen in media. There's a certain way that our stories need to be told so that people can understand. There's like a certain kind of way that a film needs to be told, either visually or through the development of the story, so that it can be, I guess you could say, like good, whatever that means. It can fit like a common conventional understanding of what that is. And I think a lot of times, coming back to that idea that we inhabit multiple places and we have multiple identities, because, just for myself as an example, my family is Chinese and Taiwanese American, and I grew up here, and my my parents were immigrants, and so the values coming from the culture of that lineage is sometimes directly in opposition to sort of white American culture. And so you literally have things that are completely the opposite of each other, like running into conflicts. And an example would be, which is pretty common, is that there's sort of a tradition of honoring your elders and your ancestors, and that's seen as very important. And here it's like basically when you become older and elderly and infirm, it's like, okay, you kind of lose your value. You may not know what you're talking about. You're kind of basically sort of seen as sort of like less valuable or less important in society. And those are completely the opposite values of each other. And so how do you reconcile that? You can't. So you're basically inhabiting two different spheres of worlds from which you have to switch back and forth. And in one world you value one thing, and in the other world you value something else. And so or there's a norm or rule in one culture, and when you go to the other culture it's something completely different. And so I think there's actually a lot of BIPOC filmmakers, people who are immigrants, people who may be queer, who actually, are familiar with like living in this sort of fractured sense of identity where there's like multiple selves that you go through. And, people experience that to varying degrees, just being, a son or a daughter versus like a mother or a father, versus being, at work versus at home, that sort of thing. But I think for our communities, there's a stronger sense of that. And so, for example, I know filmmakers who are very interested in, including myself, using visual language and documentary and using the way that the story plays out to reflect that kind of fractured experience of life that we go through constantly. And sometimes that creates work that people say like, oh, well, this isn't how a film should go. This isn't how I understand a film to be. Or, what are all these different, what are all these different things doing in this film together? But the reality is that that's how some of us experience our lives. And that's actually a form of trying to represent that experience in, sort of this visual way. And so, so there's kind of like urges to do things like that. But then when you run into sort of the dominant white culture in the industry, it's kind of like, oh, okay, no, you need to make it like this where we can all understand,
Sure. So I thought of a couple of different things while you were speaking. And so one is this idea of what is good work, who is actually deciding what is good work. As a professor, I remember telling a friend of mine, a filmmaker friend, and saying, oh, well, I try to only show like the best films so that they get a really good idea. And then she said, but you should show some really bad films so they can see what that looks like, because otherwise they walk around thinking, okay, this is like, these films are the gold standard. They can be different, differently made films, but like these are like the best films according to Professor Levert, who got it from some other people, right? Which, to be fair, is generally coming from the dominant culture. In that, looking at you know, the things that are on the short list for the Oscars, or things that are getting validated, by and large, by BIPOC filmmakers, but these things are being validated by the dominant culture in general. And then, so thinking about like what is good, and then what is bad. So thinking about it in those regards. And then I also thought about like people who are in acquisition and programming. We're totally influenced by the dominant culture in terms of what should and shouldn't be seen in many ways, because I also think that like those people, you know, perhaps those people who are getting feedback, they're coming, you know, they're working for funders, they're working, you know, because quite frankly, there's very few known to me organizations that are run by BIPOC people, you know, making those decisions. So therefore, their vision of acquisition and even funding is coming down through that lens as well. I'm noticing for myself, like, what is that? And then, you know, showing films that stretch outside of that, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, there, in terms of like, you know, what is good film or not, I mean, on a basic level, there's some sense of like, you know, the technical elements, right? So, you know, I don't think, you know, people can completely disregard that. And so, you know, there is, you know, sort of like the way the camera is used, you know, the lighting, you know, the audio, you know, making sure that it's something that makes sense in terms of like, why are you making the choices you're making and what do they mean on a basic level, sort of technically speaking.
Sure.
And I think that, so, you know, so I think that there's like the idea of technically what is good work, right? And then I think there's this more subjective thing, which is that, you know, what makes something worthy of our attention and that accomplishes the purpose that the filmmaker set out for it, right? And I think one thing is that, you know, people have different purposes with their films. And so, you know, the purpose of a piece that is more along the lines of a social justice film that's more educational could be to, you know, motivate someone to understand a problem, to be activated to know how to make a change or to be willing to get involved, you know, to make changes. But that's not the only kind of film, right? So in documentary, there's also other forms. And so, you know, like for example, in you know, personal storytelling, it might be so that you have an experience of spending time with people and coming to understand them and who they are in a way that's different than maybe your preconceived notions. Or if you haven't been exposed to people, then, you know, you feel like that you gained a new perspective. Or if it's a, you know, community that's very similar to, you know, one that you are involved with or engaged with, that you feel like that you recognize something there. And so that's a very different purpose to that kind of film, right? That makes a sense of like, well, good meaning, is it accomplishing that purpose or not, you know? Someone who's making a more experimental kind of documentary may say, well, I just wanted you to have an experience, and that experience was whatever, fill in the blank. And if you had that experience while you're watching the film, then great, then, you know, accomplished its purpose and it was good, you know. And maybe that experience might be like confusion or doubt or you know, like anger or, you know, feeling a certain way about something they're presenting, right? So you know, people who are even more artistic, you know, might say, well, I have a certain vision about what I'm doing and I have an idea behind it, but it's really up to you to sort of sort out whether or not how you react to that, right? What are you bringing to that experience? So there's so many different ways of looking at it, but for some reason, you know, I think especially in the American industry, we've gotten really concerned about, you know, whether or not documentary films can become this sort of product that can end up on certain distribution outlets and that can, you know, generate income or be sold. And, you know, admittedly, you know, people know in the field that you know, covers a relatively small number of documentaries in the industry. There's apparently lots of documentary filmmakers, regardless of, you know, whether or not they're already marginalized, who have a really difficult time making a living off of documentaries. You know, and then on top of that, there's this pressure to sort of like move towards films that have some kind of commercial value or content that can be monetized in some kind of way. And so I think that, you know, I think that between all of that, then, you know, you have the situation also of where the cultural lens is so vital in terms of understanding the works, the films as well. So I know this is not documentary, but, you know, you have sort of this year with all the attention on the Black Lives Matter movement and the role that Black people are playing in our society or not playing, you have the president of the Criterion Collection basically saying that he didn't understand what he was seeing when he first saw Daughters of the Dust, which is why they didn't initially have it with their collection. And that film is obviously a classic now, but he didn't know what he was looking at. And so he couldn't make any kind of sort of judgment on, whether or not this was something that was accomplishing its purpose. And so when you have that kind of situation happening, and it continues to happen, and you could say that it happens maybe more, with white people in the industry, but I think it certainly happens with other people who are conditioned to think of documentary as a very specific kind of film, then people don't actually necessarily know what are they looking at.
Right.
So
right.
I feel like we really need to broaden and expand that understanding among more people of, what do we mean by documentary and what's possible in the realm of documentary? And what you're talking about, imagining the future and how to broaden and expand that, I think it's very much tied into this idea of how can we envision a way of using this media to express ourselves, to have important things we want to say in the world about our communities, about other communities, that can be done in a more artful, truthful, passionate way. And that involves sometimes making things that we're not, as sort of, we being the, sort of, mainstream doc industry are not as familiar with. And so, and part of that too is this idea, I think I was talking with you before about the idea of who is the we that is considered, we think this, we think that, we have this idea or opinion, in the documentary field. A lot of times, as BIPOC filmmakers, we're switching between sort of we as ourselves and we meaning like the dominant white culture.
Sure.
And, is that what I think, or is that what I know people are expecting of me, and what that dominant culture thinks about us, actually.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking about this whole idea of conditioning, because I think that's what I was getting at in terms of like this, inquiry and like what is good, what is considered good. And that's like a conditioning about, okay, these are the films that are celebrated, so therefore these films are good, right? And then films that are not celebrated are bad or less good or not considered in the same category. And then, so what I'm hearing is actually one of the things where we can start to reimagine is broadening the definition, but like not like we have pretty broad definitions of documentary, but in actuality, they're very narrow in terms of like what is celebrated, work. And I think about, Ramel Ross's film, Hale County This Evening. You can barely find it. It didn't get picked up for distribution. I mean, I don't know what the distribution situation was. Maybe he said, I don't want it, or I didn't want it, under certain conditions. So I have no idea. But, when I look at that, and then just thinking about Julie Dash, who, shout out, she's a professor at Spelman College. And, she talked about her film not being a part of Criterion, even though there were other filmmakers from her class at, part of the LA Rebellion, like Killer Sheep, by Charles Burnett was already in there. And so it's definitely a situation of conditioning in terms of what is. And then, but now what I see is that, like, because of her film, that whole, there's, in many ways, there's so many films that are now utilizing that same kind of aesthetic and idea, and it's almost like a subgenre. Like I can definitely point to, Beyonce and other filmmakers who are doing the same kind of, it stylistically puts me in the mind of Daughters of the Dust, right? It often puts me in mind in that. So then I'm thinking of like validation. validation. Where do we get validated? Because, the truth of the matter is that we're humans with egos, and, you just can't, keep making something without some kind of validation. Yes, as you're making your film, you're like, okay, you still have a vision for where it will live. It doesn't necessarily have to live at Sundance or, go to an Oscar or something like that. And I would say that until recent years, that wasn't even a thing as a BIPOC filmmaker. Like, you were not even thinking that your film would be nominated for, for an Academy Award. It was just like, if I can get it on PBS, it will reach millions of the people that I want it to reach. That's awesome. I'm not trying to do a theatrical release, that sort of thing. So just thinking about validation, especially if we're going to be pushing against the conditioning or what is lauded as good films, right? If we're pushing against that.
Well, yeah, I think there's so much that you said there, and there's so much that's part of that conversation, and I think that I'm gonna take like kind of a slightly different way to sort of like look at that issue and sort of maybe talk about what's happening there from my point of view, or part of that conversation I'm interested in.
Thank you.
So in terms of Hell County this evening, it did appear, as you said, on a certain venue that we get onto, which is Independent Lens. And so, and that does reach a lot of people. But I'm thinking about that in relationship to, why do you have the sensation that it's like, okay, it's hard to see this film? I mean, the reality is that like most younger people, especially, and I think a lot of people in general, are sort of watching a lot of what I would call documentary on other platforms, actually. And it's not necessarily like Netflix, although that's a really popular one. But I mean that technically anything that somebody is documenting in real time, in real life, that's actually a real thing that's happening, is a form of documentary. And people are doing that with their cell phones, with their whatever, their
Absolutely.
iPads. They're doing that in all kinds of ways. And so, what you're seeing on YouTube, on Twitch, on like TikTok, those, some of that is entertainment, but some of that is actually documentary. And so there's this idea that, there's a certain kind of sort of classic filmmaking that's documentary. And at the same time, I see a tremendous amount of, sort of content and time and energy being made on a very, you could say on a very like lo-fi grassroots level, by people on, on their own phones, and documenting all kinds of like really fascinating and interesting and amazing things. And that's actually getting millions of views, way more than some documentaries will ever have in their entire sort of like run or their entire lifetime.
Absolutely.
And so when we're talking about like, why is it hard to see some of these things, and yet somebody has seen, half the people have seen some kind of like video or some kind of thing that's been going around on social media. I think it does speak to, there's kind of this disconnect that's happening between a very vibrant and sort of grassroots and sort of do-it-yourself kind of way of documenting the world and people telling their own stories, and the sort of like classic filmmaking genre that's happening. And I hope the two can sort of start to converge more and start to maybe, take some things from each other, and there can be room in the, documentary nonfiction world for, embracing this thing that's happening. It's in a way a very populist movement around documenting the world and telling stories. And so, so I think there is something to that, because I think the people who are part of public media would say, well, we did get this film out, and this film is being, has been seen in places. But if you're looking at that scale versus the scale of what's happening in terms of these other outlets and what's happening in terms of social media, it's, it's really like a drop in the bucket, right? More people have seen, content that is, that's not films per se, but that are, you could say that are a form of documentation. They may be sort of like mini vignettes, they're not films in sort of the classic sense of like, there's some kind of beginning, middle, and end per se, with like, specific people that are, being followed in order to tell a very organized type of story. But I feel like that these are actually forms of documentary, or at the minimum nonfiction storytelling.
Right.
And
Right.
so, I think our minds need to expand beyond, like sort of saying, okay, the only thing that's documentary are these sort of like classic film forms.
Right, right. Well, which is interesting because also as a professor teaching undergrads is that what I notice is that, I I laugh because I feel obligated. I'm not exactly obligated, but I feel obligated to show like these quote unquote classic films. But of course they, and to be fair is that I program them during class because then I know that they'll watch them. If I program them for like homework, I I do not feel confidence that they'll watch them. So I program them during class so that they'll see them. And but what they really gravitate to is these new forms, so like the things that are considered the filmmakers and the films that are considered experimental, because as you were saying previously, is that they get and they like that fractured form. Now granted, there are definitely some who are just like minds blown. They're like, is that a documentary? Because they only consider talking heads B-roll to be documentary. Even when I show them like things that even just verite films, like a film that is all verite, they're just like, is that really a documentary? Because nobody, sat down and talked to the camera, or, talked about something, or explained something, in a very classical sense. So it's also interesting to me how they mostly gravitate to that. And then when I ask them to make a film, guess what they make? They make the classic documentary form. They sit somebody down, they interview that person, and then if they remember, they will have some B-roll. So it's interesting that like the conditioning of people who, have grown up with this classic sense of documentary, because they're introduced to documentary, K through 12 as educational films, right? And that's
Right.
not the experimental stuff.
And there's also, I mean, I just want to acknowledge that there's a long tradition in American documentary of other kinds of documentary forms, right? But I think that, unless you're fortunate enough to be exposed to that, to study it, to be in an environment where, I do think it's important to be educated about the different sort of types of documentaries that have come, throughout, the decades in this country,
Mm-hmm.
and, all the variety that has been there. But I think that the current sort of like dominant, popularized, kind of commercially successful films kind of fall within a certain range, right? So in American, filmmaking, there has been, some really great, verite films. There have been some really great personal films. There have been some great, like essay films and experimental films. But for some reason, somehow the current American market has sort of like, crystallized around like, specific ways of storytelling, which, do include verite films as well. But I think that it's like, I think it's important for people to know that there's been different kinds of films. They haven't always necessarily been, how do I say, like ones that have become wildly successful, that have like deeply embodied our point of view. I mean, there's a few, we can think of off the top of our heads, obviously like, Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied,
Mm-hmm.
things like that, that kind of really break, sort of the, all kinds of conventions, as well as somehow
Absolutely.
being deeply authentic to sort of, kind of the
And
community and the
personal.
vision, and personal, and the way he was trying to express how he saw himself and others and in the world. And so I think that there's some examples like that, but for some reason I feel like there's a lot of, and maybe I don't know if it's like sort of the increasing sort of like I guess you could say people starting to look at documentaries as a more commercial venture, right? That there's a possibility to have investors. There's a possibility to really, make some profits depending on the kind of film that you're making. That more people are watching documentaries, which is a good thing in general. Right. But the downside of that is like not recognizing sort of this legacy of different kinds of documentaries, and then how can BIPOC filmmakers be part of creating new and different sorts of,
Mm-hmm.
sort of ways ways of storytelling, ways of
Mm-hmm.
using visual language, of using sort of the audio landscape, to be able to express something that we're interested in.
Right. I was thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking about how PBS, and particularly the different consortiums that exist for the different BIPOC groups, and how they took a chance and really championed Tongues Untied, and they almost got shut down because of it. Maybe what we can start to reimagine is that, these classic, these films that we're currently conditioned to think about as like
the model, like
the model. Yes, this perfect.
Yeah, this is kind of the model, or the kind of film that you want.
Right. So then we can. So then maybe the consortiums can go back to supporting films that are outside of that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I sort of feel like that's actually a comment that I've heard, several filmmakers make, who, they came into filmmaking either not in this country, or they're more familiar with filmmaking outside of this country.
Mm-hmm.
And I think partly, because of government support and, other factors, sometimes there's a sense that American documentary has kind of fallen into the certain zone of filmmaking, and that a lot of the sort of like, the boundary pushing and sort of the innovations are happening elsewhere and not necessarily here.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just sort of my own opinion, but I've heard, other people, especially people who are, going to filmmaking, outside of the U.S. and, or who have originated from outside of the U.S., kind of wondering, why are a lot of American documentary films, falling into a certain, zone. So I think that's really important to think about. And then I think that if we're going to sort of shift what's happening with the funding or the interest in films, I feel like that it's a lot of that is, I think, supporting these sort of like grassroots collectives and initiatives, and sort of supporting sort of filmmakers who are kind of coming together on a local level, who are really interested in supporting each other. And this is happening in different places around the country, who are interested in sort of retaking their narratives, and who are interested in doing place-based filmmaking. And so, one of the programs that Represent Media does is Retake Oakland, which is basically filmmakers who live in or have a strong connection to Oakland, who are making films about Oaklanders. And so it's kind of this very locally based, situation where queer and BIPOC filmmakers are making films about people in our own communities. And I think that, more of that can be encouraged and supported. I know that in Detroit, there's Detroit Narrative Agency that has kind of a similar model of people in communities who, with them, they have a much more diverse cohort of like people's backgrounds and why they're coming into filmmaking, some who have experience and some who don't, and really, being able to tell their own local stories. And so I think this idea of not just sort of like redirecting resources, towards a broader range of films within the documentary industry, but also supporting these local initiatives and collectives and groups of people who are wanting to do different kinds of films and storytelling, and to have a different kind of relationship to the people in their films. And how do we support that as well? The documentary industry has a history of the people who are successful and are making money, and who are doing really well. There's a number of people, especially white people, who have done that through an extractive process of filmmaking and making films about BIPOC communities in ways that are actually sometimes damaging to our communities. And so, I think it's really important to also look at and think about the idea of the redistribution of resources, because those resources were not just sort of amassed, with certain, in certain parts of the industry, because there was a sort of, fair and equal process happening. There was this extractive process that was happening. And I think it should be on our minds, like, how do we actually look at the redistribution of resources within the industry because that process has happened. So it's
Right.
not like saying, oh, okay, we need to invest more in, certain people because, they're struggling and, they don't have, they don't have the same assets that we do or the same opportunities and all this kind of stuff. It's like, on some level, it's about, giving back what was taken also.
Right. Right. Which is interesting. And that's generally like the narrative that gets, played out or distributed, so to speak, in the dominant documentary industry. And then, we have to, we as BIPOC filmmakers, so I'm very conscious. So Jennifer, you've made me very conscious of like we and like distinguishing who is we, right? So, so BIPOC documentary filmmakers have to be cognizant and careful to not drink the Kool-Aid, so to speak, or take on that we are struggling, need help, and this, that, and the other, when if you actually think about it, you, dominant culture, stand on our backs, just as you're saying, like in everything, there's been this extractive process. And so actually you're able to be successful because of us, right? And then you shut us out of the conversation. Over the summer, or towards the end of the summer, the brouhaha about the white filmmakers making the film about Tiger Woods. This is extractive. And then I actually fault the distributor on that. So it's the filmmakers, yes, and who they're hiring for their team, but you, distributor, are also supposedly woke as well, and you did this, which then leads me to just believe that like actually you have no intention of creating change. You put out your Black Lives Matter statement, and I can only say that I can only go by your actions instead of words. So I've also been thinking about collectives. I'm so glad that you brought that up as a way to bring people together to create new and different work, right? And with support, because ultimately, that's what filmmaking is about, is community, is support. Like you can't, you can make a film by yourself, but it's a lonely and long road.
Yeah, I mean, I think that collectives can support around filmmaking and also around having these kinds of conversations. And so one thing that's been on my mind a lot is that, we're really having different conversations in the field. And so there's a conversation that people have, BIPOC filmmakers have amongst ourselves and, peers and other people. And then there's the conversation that happens in the larger public sphere. And those conversations, as I would say, most of us, or hopefully we should all know, they're not the same conversation. And that happens for very good reasons. People have fear of backlash, of like being blacklisted, of not getting work, of not getting grants, of people thinking that they're difficult. White people, usually thinking they're difficult, but people in positions of power, gatekeepers, that's that, angry filmmaker who keeps complaining about, how things aren't right or whatever, And so people don't want to jeopardize their relationships and their opportunities. And so we're having separate conversations actually about what is going on and what the nature of the problems even are. And my feeling is that, we can't actually solve the problems we're having if we're not actually talking about them explicitly in terms of what they are. And so, a lot of times we talk about, diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we're not talking about experiences of racism, oppression, and white supremacy. And we're not talking about the things that, we have a meeting, like, in a mixed group sort of, and get very frustrated. And then we go back and talk amongst ourselves, among other BIPOC filmmakers, right? But that conversation doesn't happen in the larger public and group level. And so I actually think that for real deep change to happen, that cannot continue in the same way that it has been, because, there's no way to sort of like, protect white people from a certain kind of conversation and actually have them understand what is even going on a deeper level.
Right.
And
I'm just wondering, do they as actually care? Because on one hand, it's like, let's have these conversations. And then the moment that the conversation starts to, go deeper, and there's a level of reckoning, or there's a moment where there's needs to be acknowledgement, and it's direct, then it's like, woo, 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 shut down. Hey, everybody, let's take a break. Let's diffuse the situation. So I oftentimes am just, to be fair, I actually just got to a point where I was like, no more talk. No more talk. I need to figure out the way forward for me and my peoples, and start off on that journey. No more talking, because this is, on one hand, you say that you as in the dominant culture want to hear, but actually when it comes down to it, no, don't want to hear at all.
I'm kind of on the fence about that, because I've also heard from other filmmakers who are, BIPOC filmmakers who are interested in making different work, or who are, either younger or earlier in their careers, or less established in some way, but also people who are interested in different kinds of forms of storytelling, who have that same feeling, who are actually breaking off from the industry, so to speak, or the field, and basically saying, we're going to do this in our own way by ourselves, and find ways to distribute, in smaller ways, with, maybe with smaller festivals, in more community forums, with partners in different sectors that aren't typically part of the film industry at all. And so I'm kind of a little bit on the fence about, is that a good thing or not, right? You actually have kind of a group of people who are like splitting off from the documentary sector because they're saying this isn't serving our needs. And that I don't hear that being talked about very much, that there's people who are trying to just go outside of this system and say this is not even working. And it's not an uncommon conversation that I run into. And the other thing, that you said is, why try to change the conversation in the larger field? Why try to, talk with people, white people in particular, who may not understand where we're coming from? And I think it's actually to be able to assert for myself that what I see and what I experience is real, and that it has a right to exist and take up space. And that it's not so much that I have to convince someone else that they need to do something, or they need to react or respond. I hope that they would be interested. I hope that they would be curious, or have some interest in where I'm coming from. But ultimately, I feel like it's good for me to just say, in a very simple, straightforward way, it doesn't have to be sort of like critical, or calling people out, or in, or upset in any kind of way, but to simply say, this is my experience. And that it, and to validate that it deserves to have a place in the larger conversation. And that it's not just a conversation I have to keep behind closed doors, with certain people and in a certain place. And I also have to acknowledge that, because of the kind of work that I do, because of the kind of films that I make, I'm also not dependent upon, certain sources of revenue and income in the industry, so that I can take more risks. Sure. So that I can, say, okay, I'm going to say what's on my mind, and I'm not worried about, whether this funder or distributor is going to, not work with me, or not pick up my film, or not give me, a contract for X, Y, or Z. And not everyone is in that position, and people need to make money to pay their bills. And so I think it's totally appropriate that some people may say, well, I'm not having that conversation, I don't feel like I can take that risk. But I think that white people in the industry need to understand that even the idea that there's like a significant concern of actually not telling the truth about our experiences because we're afraid that there's going to be a negative consequence is not a good sort of culture to be in. Sure. And how did we get here, and how can we change that? And I have some hope that there are enough, sort of well-meaning white people in the industry who got into this work because they care about making the world a better place. And especially now with all the things happening in this country, socially and politically, that people want to know and want to make this change and want to start listening. So that's my hope, anyway.
From listening to you, it also seems that like to have those conversations is about validating the BIPOC experience in this dominant culture, but validation actually comes from the BIPOC community. Because if the dominant culture is not getting where you're coming from, so then who does? who got Julie Dash's film, who got Marlon Riggs' film first, right? And then other people came around to it, so to speak, or were, you know, made to come around to it, so to speak. I'm just wondering, so then I see myself, then it's validated through people who look, feel, speak, understand me, and then therefore I'm validated. So as opposed to looking for people to validate who don't get it, right? Because that's like pushing a rock up a hill.
Right. I mean, I think the community has a big part to do with it. I mean, I think I kind of got to this point in my career because I have been around a lot of very supportive BIPOC filmmakers who like understand what I'm trying to do and believe in what I'm doing, and I believe in their work and I support them as well. And a lot of times, as you said, pushing this rock up the hill, sort of in the field. And I think that, you know, definitely a community is a big part of that, and supporting, you know, each other with that. And I think ultimately there's, you know, something to be said about just being able to be comfortable saying things in a more authentic way in spaces that are safe to do so for the people for whom it's safe to do that, right? So, you know, obviously, you know, in certain places and situations, there's consequences. Historically, in the past, you know, if people said or did certain things, you know, outside of documentary filmmaking, or even maybe within, I don't know, but in the larger culture, definitely, you know, there might even be a threat of violence or, you know, other problems or situations coming up. And certainly in parts of this country, even today, you know, you have to think about like, well, what environment am I in? Who am I speaking with more openly? You know, but there are definitely places where, and situations where we can be more vocal, and there isn't going to be a really big negative consequence depending on, you know, who we are and who we're speaking with. Right. And so to try to exercise that. Right. And so that's actually something that I learned, that I heard from a really great workshop that was done by Ken Hardy, who speaks a lot about cross-cultural communication, actually, and about the fact that, you know, that basically people of color need to be able to do our part in cross-cultural communication by not self-censoring. So in the appropriate environments, right? So like our challenge is that, you know, we sometimes self-censor when we don't need to self-censor. We're trying to caretake, you know, people in the dominant culture, and trying, you know, not to make them feel uncomfortable or actually having a problem that they created, you know? So, you know, which is like really kind of like, what? But, you know, but, you know, so, you know, who wants to deal with that kind of dynamic? Right, but I think there are safe places where, you know, people are curious and are interested. And I think just, you know, the expectations can't be, well, I'm going to say my part and then people are going to get it and they're going to start wanting to make major changes. I think the expectation is, you know, I speak my part so that, you know, I can assert that I have this right to be here, and that what I see and what I experience is real and important. And that is not just for a conversation, you know, with people like me. It's a conversation that needs to be out there in the larger world. You know, talking about imagining or reimagining the future, you know, what is the role of dreams? And I feel like it's really important to have dreams as a core way to sort of reimagine and to motivate us to, you know, where are we going? What are we trying to do? And we can't just like deal with problems and solve problems and through that come to a new place, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive, right? It's like, okay, well, if we fix the problems that we have, you know, in the industry, you know, that are sort of like oppressive to BIPOC filmmakers, you know, why isn't that enough? You know, we need to have dreams. We need to have a vision. And, you know, there's this African-American professor, Sean Gidenwright. He teaches at San Francisco State University. And he also does other speaking engagements. And I heard him at this workshop where, you know, he often works with, you know, urban youth who are dealing with like, you know, poverty, environmental challenges, you know, other things. And he basically says, you know, it is not enough to solve our problems. You know, we have to have dreams. We need something to move towards and to go for. Dreaming is an essential part of this sort of healing process that needs to happen in communities. And part of this oppressive, you know, extractive cycle is taking dreams from us and saying that, you know, your dreams can't be so big, your dreams can't be fulfilled, you know, that they're not possible. And on a realistic level, right, you could say, well, okay, not everyone can achieve their dreams, but there's something really expansive and healing about the capacity to dream, regardless of whether or not you tangibly reach that specific, the manifestation of that specific dream, right, in a practical way. But, so I think that there needs to be a bigger role for, what is the role of dreams, collective dreams, personal dreams, visioning. That's partly why I think this, this interest that's happening in Afrofuturism that's picking up, in film and also in other areas is really, hopeful to me.
Yes. Well, I heard once Kamala Harris got nominated, they had a quote from a documentary filmmaker, Shola Lynch, or Shala Lynch, I think it's Shola Lynch, who made the film about Shirley Chisholm, Unbought and Unbossed. She's saying that Shirley Chisholm was a futurist. She had a dream that was, unfathomable by, every stretch of the imagination, and she still pursued it, right? And in many ways, new things only happen because of dreams. And it's the pursuit of dreams in many ways that brings power and agency, and if nothing else, we always have agency.
We often talk as BIPOC filmmakers about the struggles we're having, and it is a struggle. And so many challenges we have. And, what does the dream look like? What does liberation look like? I think it looks like being more often in a state, and not to say we don't have challenges in life, that's always going to happen, but more often in a state where we're happy, joyous, and free.
That's a great note. You know what? That's definitely one to meditate on and really embody.
I think the love that we have for each other, for our communities, why we keep staying motivated in this work, why we want to continue even though there's so many challenges and struggles, is love, love for ourselves, for our people, for each other. And yeah, it's great to be doing that.
Jennifer, thank you so very much.
Thanks, Anjanette. Happy to be here.
You've been incredibly generous with your time and in your sharing. And so that's what I have. So, to my audience, thank you so much for joining us and listening in. And I hope that you really got something from it. And I invite you to tune into our next episode. So until then, dream bigger for our future forward. Thank you.